Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to API Management with Boomi. Um, so this is really interesting content. I had a lot of fun kind of pulling it together, and kind of pleased to share that with you today. I think most of you on the call know me, but for those who don't or those who are watching later, my name's Shane Fisher. I'm a senior architect with Big Compass and also the Boomi practice manager. Have been in the Boomi space for about 6 years and one of my favorite things to talk about. So we do a lot of Boomi webinars here. So stay tuned for more of these. Okay, so what are we going to cover today? So we're going to start off with going over the Boomi platform, API management and integration. So there's kind of, the Boomi platform has a lot of components to it, main product features, I should say. And specifically, we're going to kind of compare and contrast basic Boomi integration with Boomi's API management product. Like, how are those things different? We're going to review the API management conceptual model. We're going to talk a little bit about infrastructure, specifically gateways and brokers, and how that relates to API management. We're going to talk about security, specifically groups, roles, users, and how those play in the API management space. We're going to also talk about how to consume APIs via plans, applications, and subscriptions. And then we've got a lot of demo content to get through. So I'm going to try to get through kind of the soft stuff as quickly as possible and then get into the hands-on demos. So we've got about 5 demos lined up. One is going to be deploying an API service component, deploying an API proxy, gateway security. We've got 2 different demos on that, specifically around basic auth and API key identification, and also SAML with Okta. And then finally, the developer portal. At the end, we'll do a recap. We'll go over some resources, and then we'll open it up for questions. If that sounds good, we'll go ahead and jump into it. Okay, so from a Boomi platform perspective, so as I said before, Boomi is kind of a wide and deep platform that has a lot of feature sets in it that are centered around specific products. The one that most of us are familiar with is the integration product. That's one, it's kind of the Boomi's bread and butter. That's what we use most often. But there's also other products, including API management, MDH, which is their MDM product, EDI, B2B, kind of stuff, Boomi Flow, which is kind of their BPM product, DCP, data catalog and prep. So there's a lot of different products that Boomi provides, all as part of this single platform. So specifically, I want to zoom in on both integration and API management. And the reason why I want to do that is because both of these product sets deal with APIs. And so what I'd like to do is sort of compare and contrast what's different about just using the standard integration product to deal with APIs versus using API management. So one of the things that we're going to talk about is the difference between an API service, which you can see right here, and an API proxy. And we'll get into a little bit more of that on the next slide. Specifically for integration on the integration platform, we're developing API components, deploying to environments, and configuring environment settings. And on the API management side of things, we're configuring gateways and brokers. We're configuring the developer portal, managing authentication, and managing API subscriptions. Okay, so if I actually compare Boomi integration APIs versus API management across these different capabilities, what do we see? So first of all, where is the configuration managed? So in Boomi integration, we manage API configurations via the shared web server setting. So it's kind of a panel within your ATA management that applies to the entire runtime. And that has implications that we'll talk about later. From an API management standpoint, obviously we're managing all that stuff within the API management screens. Authentication methods are pretty limited from just a standard Boomi integration perspective. You can do none, you can do basic, and then some pretty simple client certificate or client certificate header authentication methods. Within API management, you have a lot more kind of rich capabilities. So you can use API keys, and then you can use what's called an authentication broker, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But within that, you have different capabilities around basic authentication, OpenID, and SAML. Another difference is your ability to mix authentication methods. So as I said before, if you're just using Boomi integration to build APIs, all of your APIs that you deploy have to follow the same authentication method, meaning you set it for the entire runtime across all your APIs. Within API management, this is much finer grained control. We can actually control this at the API level. With respect to policy types, within Boomi integration APIs, it's simple. It's access or no access. So it's pretty Boolean. But within API management, again, more feature rich here. Not only can we provide access and revoke that access, but we can do things like rate limiting, set quotas, and set size limits for message sizes. And then for resource paths, like these would be the URL that you actually access the API. Within Boomi integration, those are pretty fixed. They're derived from a base URL that applies to the entire runtime, concatenated with essentially the API name. And there's some other things that kind of play into there as well, such as the type of API it is, whether it's SOAP or REST or OData. But they're pretty fixed. You can't, they're not terribly flexible. Within API management, this is fully customizable for each API, but the key requirement here is that they all have to resolve uniquely. Okay. This is probably going to look like a bit of an eye chart, but my hope is that we'll be able to review this a little bit later and have a lot more understanding. But essentially what this represents is the conceptual model for APIs on the Boomi platform. And I'll talk us through this very quickly, but we'll get into some details and some of these specific components later on in the presentation. So at the highest level, we basically have API management on this side, and this side sort of represents Boomi standard integration. Okay, and these two things still play together to accomplish an API management flow. Starting from the left and going to the right, we have something called a gateway, which is sort of the entry point into API management at the runtime. We have an authentication broker, which is actually doing the heavy lifting of authenticating requests that come in to a specific API. And then we have a concept called an application. You've probably seen this before if you've ever done any OAuth work, where you go in and register. If you're an API consumer, you actually register with the service something called an application. So this is pretty standard fare. And that application essentially represents you as a consumer. So in this example, this application actually has two subscriptions. We'll talk about what subscriptions are in a minute. One is for the inventory API. The other one is for the billing API. And then we also have these things called plans. So a plan actually is a collection of policies that get attached to APIs. And we'll talk about these in a minute, but the combination of an API, a plan, and a subscription results in an API key. And we'll see how this works in a little bit. So when a request comes in, essentially that API key is what uniquely identifies a consumer calling a specific API with a specific plan. And then here you have API proxies. So these are the APIs that we've deployed to API management. And then finally at the back end, this represents on the integration side, the implementation of that API. I'm assuming most people know who are on this call or who are going to watch this video later. You know what an API is, so I'm not going to go into detail on that. But for all intents and purposes, this sort of represents the API proxies. This represents the API's implementation on the integration side of things. So gateways and brokers. So what are those? So an API gateway is sort of the entry point into API management at runtime. So it manages the governance of APIs, which means identifying which plan is associated with which consumer, and then applying a specific policy to ensure that they're allowed access to that API. For example, if somebody has a rate limiting policy and they've already exceeded their number of calls, the API gateway will enforce that and basically return an error to the consumer. The API gateway also allows for more advanced security models than atom-controlled authentication. We've talked about that already. It's largely configured in the API management section of AtomSphere. It's installed on a different machine than your runtime atoms. So in my example, the environment we're going to go through in a minute here, I've got everything installed locally, but definitely not recommended for production. It's good enough just to do kind of a demo, but in a real sort of an application, you would want to have those on different machines. And then it also provides a migration utility to move from, if you have a bunch of APIs deployed on the integration side that you want to elevate to API management, there's an actual utility that you can run that will migrate those APIs. Now, on the broker side of things, that's actually what manages your authentication. They're also called authentication brokers. These free up Atom runtime resources from having to do sort of the heavy lifting of the security work. Again, generally installed on different machines than the Atom runtimes. You can cluster these with a shared disk in production environments. Ours that we're going to use today is not clustered, but that's okay. And then, yeah, we've already said broker and gateway. Generally, you don't want those installed in the same VM, but in today's example, we're doing that. Okay, so going back to this picture again, this hopefully adds a little bit more context to how this works at runtime. So in this example, we have an API consumer that is invoking an API through the gateway. The gateway needs to authenticate the request first, so it offloads that work to the authentication broker. In this case, this API is secured via SAML and Okta. So it uses the SAML authentication source, directs that to Okta to authenticate. And then once they're authenticated, that request gets directed to the rest of the API management runtime. And then this is where we identify by their API key. You can see this API key right here. We're identifying that this is subscription 2 to the billing API, and we're applying plan B, which is 100 requests per day. And then, so we're allowing access as long as they have not exceeded that 100 requests per day. We're letting them through to call the billing API, which is a proxy, which ultimately calls the billing API backend on the integration side for the implementation. So hopefully that helps clarify what that looks like at runtime. Okay. Another concept that's really important to understand in API management is users, groups, and roles. So the way I like to think of this is that roles are collections of privileges. So it's what can you access? For example, can you access the developer portal or can you access specific APIs? Groups, on the other hand, are collections of people. This is the who. So who are these people that we're giving access to? And the way we configure basic auth within Boomi is that we assign users to groups. So for example, if I create an account for myself, I can add myself to the developer group. It's a collection of people. And then we can assign groups to roles. So I can assign developers to a collection of privileges, such as admin privileges, using the admin role. So that's generally how that works. Another thing to call out here is that these are not the same users, groups, and roles that we see with Boomi integration. So this is something a little bit different. It's more specific to API management authentication types. Another thing to be aware of is that you don't have to define these locally. You can actually import these or synchronize these from an external identity provider. However, today, just for simplicity, we're just going to use local users. Okay. All right, so we've talked a lot about kind of the provider side of things, meaning, how do we expose APIs? So this is a little bit about how we consume those APIs from a consumer standpoint, okay? So 3 key concepts that we need to understand. So there's a plan, an application, and a subscription. We've talked a little bit about applications, but let me go into more detail on some of these. So the way I like to think of these is the relationship you have with your cell phone provider. So your cell phone provider provides rate plans, right? And so you can see the example here. There's an unlimited plan for $35 per person. There's an unlimited LTE plan, right? So we're defining different plans that a consumer can select, okay? So in our example, within API management, this is a collection of policies. And those policies are things like message size, rate limit, quota limit, things like that, okay? And one thing to note is all of your deployed APIs have to have at least one plan defined or assigned to it, okay? And these are provider defined. So similar to kind of the cell phone analogy, these aren't things that you and I define. These are things that Verizon, T-Mobile, AT&T, they define these things, okay? Now an application is actually what identifies us. So that's you and me kind of in the cell phone scenario, okay? Applications subscribe to APIs, and these are consumer defined, okay? So I can go in and basically create an application. Now this is kind of where the rubber hits the road. We have something called a subscription. So again, similar to kind of the cell phone analogy, if I'm me, I've selected a rate plan from a cell phone provider, I now have a subscription. It's an active thing that I can authenticate, I can use the device, things like that, okay? So that's kind of the same in this scenario as well. We're linking an application to a plan. This is also consumer requested, but it's provider approved. So when I go in, I create a request to subscribe to a specific API, and a provider of that API has to approve that request. Okay. Once that's approved, I actually get something called an API key, which we'll see a lot of in a little bit here. And that enables me to invoke the API via that subscription. And kind of this final note down here is that all 3 of these things basically come together to, and that's what enables you to have an API key, and that's what finally enables you to have access to an API. Okay. Okay, demo time. So in this first demo, we're going to be deploying an API service component. So first, we're going to start by creating a new Get Prospects folder. We're going to import from the process library. We're going to create an API service component. We're going to choose an endpoint for that API service. We're going to fill out some documentation, and then we're going to deploy the API to the environment. And then finally, we're going to add 2 rate limiting plans to that API. Okay, so that's a lot, but let's jump right into it. Okay, so this is Boomi integration right now that I'm working in. We're going to be working both in Boomi integration as well as Boomi API management. And you can see here right now, I have no APIs deployed yet, but that will hopefully change very soon here. Okay, so we said we were going to create a folder called Get Prospects. Okay. Okay. So now you can see I have a Get Prospects folder, and then we're going to look for from the process library, we're going to look for something called the prospect tracking API. And this is just for simplicity. We're going to install an API that's already been built. Okay. So we're going to go ahead and install that from the process library. Okay, hit install. Okay, so there's our API. And you can see it sitting right there. Okay, so this is an API implementation. Now we need to build an API service component. Okay, so we're going to do new component. And this is going to be of type API. And the name of this is going to be get prospects. And this is my little cheat sheet here just so we can move quickly because we have a lot to get through. Okay, we're going to call this get prospects. And you can see under API type, I can choose API proxy or API service. Okay, in this case, we're actually building an implementation. So this is an API service. So we're going to select that, hit create. Okay, and now that pulls up this screen where we can fill out some interesting bits about the API. Oops, didn't mean to do that. Okay, so we're going to call this get prospects. Version is 1, and that base API path we're just going to set to prospects/v1. We're going to click on the REST side, and now it's asking me for an implementation. So you're creating an API service, but I need an implementation. So we're actually going to import that. Okay, we're going to use an existing process. And this is that one that we just installed. And right now we're just going to select REST just to keep things simple. Hit finish. Okay, so now we have an endpoint. Great. Click on documentation. So I'm just going to fill out a couple of these things. And we'll see in a little bit, some of this information is what shows up on the developer portal. I can type, there we go. All right. I'm going to save that. Whoops. It actually wants me to do a real URL here, so let's try that. Okay, save. Okay, great. So now we have that. So what else did we say we were going to do? So we filled out the documentation tab. We're going to deploy the API to the environment and then add both rate limiting plans to the API. Okay, so let's do that next. Okay. So we're going to go into create package component. Okay, a lot of these you can just kind of sort of leave the defaults. So we're just going to create that package component. Okay, now we're going to hit deploy. I'm going to deploy this to our API production environment. Okay, prospects, package components. Okay. All right. What's interesting is it's not taking along with it. What should be happening is it should actually be taking along with it the endpoint that we created. Okay, so we have that. General, your prospects. Okay, just making sure I'm not missing anything here. Okay, let's try this again. Your prospects. Okay, that's fine. I may have to deploy the implementation separately. What's weird is I didn't have to do that last time. Actually, let's do it this way. There we go. That's what was missing. Okay. So now we have basically the entire thing. We've got the API and the implementation. We're going to go ahead and deploy that. Okay. Create package component, deploy. We're going to select our API management environment and deploy it. Okay. It says we're successful. Now let's flip over to the API management side, refresh, and see if our API showed up. And sure enough, there it is. Okay. Now, one of the things you can see right away here is that, remember, we talked about a concept of plans. So just like in the cell phone provider kind of scenario, it's saying, what are the plans that are available for consumers on this API? So we have to define that. So let's go ahead and click on incomplete here. And we've already pre-configured a couple of plans to choose from. So we're going to actually add both of those. Okay, so we've got one plan. Now let's add the other one. Okay, so now we have two plans added to this API. We have a 5 calls per minute plan. We have unlimited. Now, keep in mind, this does not mean that these two plans apply universally to every consumer of that API. What that means is that this is part of the menu that we can select for a consumer. So we can select one or both of these plans. Okay, hit save. Okay, so now you can see everything's nice and happy. We've got our plans defined. We've got our API deployed. All right, so that finishes demo 1. Okay, so what we just did was we deployed an API service component. So this is basically an API that is hosted on the integration platform. But now what we're going to do is we're going to deploy an API proxy. And what this is basically sort of a thin proxy that's managed by API management with the implementation living off of Boomi. So it's basically provided by an external provider that has nothing to do with Boomi, which is a very common use case. Okay, so the flow is going to be pretty similar. We're going to create another folder. And then we're going to create an API proxy component. We're going to import a Swagger definition. And then we're going to package it up and deploy it, and then assign both of our plans to it. Okay. Okay. So again, we're over here on the integration side of things. So we're going to add a new folder. And this one, we're going to call Pet Store API Proxy. Okay. And we're going to build a new component. And this time, again, it's an API, but this time instead of API service, this is going to be an API proxy, kind of like what we said before. Okay. Component name, what did we say we were going to call this? Pet Store API Proxy. Okay. Make sure it's pointing to the right folder. Yes, it is. Hit create. Okay, so now we're in the proxy configuration screen. So the main thing we're going to do here is import this Swagger file, which I have a handy URL to right here. So again, this is sort of an externally provided API that lives somewhere, out on the web that we're going to build a proxy to. So import, and here we can import from a file or a URL. This time we're going to choose URL. Okay, so this allows you to, if this was hiding behind sort of a basic authentication scheme, you could provide those details here. This is not, so we'll just hit next. Okay, and now this is all the things that's going to be imported into your API proxy. We're just going to unselect API description just to show you how you can override some things. Hit finish. Okay. So now we've got everything pretty much populated. We're going to write our own description here. Let's call this a Pet Store API. Okay. We also have to define this base API path. So we'll do that. Okay, whoops. Okay, everything looks good. We're going to go ahead and save that. And then similar to kind of what we did before, actually, let me just click on this, make sure I've got everything defined. And again, we can define authentication if we need to authenticate to the backend service. In this case, we don't need to do that. Documentation, we can just leave the defaults here, so we're good. Okay, so let's create that package component rather. So we have the pet store API proxy. Now, remember last time I was looking for an implementation as well. I don't need that here because again, this is hosted outside of Boomi. The implementation lives on on another server, okay? So we're gonna go ahead, finish the deployment workflow. Again, we're gonna choose the same environment, select the version. A lot of this you can kind of skip through. Okay. Cool. So now if I go back to the API management side of Boomi, I should see a second API show up. Okay, we just have one right now. Let's refresh this. And there you have it. We have our second API. Now, similar to this one, we have no plans defined. So let's do kind of what we did before. We're going to add the 5 calls per minute plan. And then we're also going to add the unlimited plan. And again, kind of what I said before, this is not saying that that API is governed by this plan. It's saying these are plans that are available on that API. And when you create a subscription, you're actually choosing one of these plans. Okay, hit save. Okay, great. So now we've got our 2 APIs deployed and we have 2 plans that are assigned. Let's see if there's anything else we need to do. Nope, I think that is it. Okay, so we've now deployed both an API proxy and an API service component. Now we get into the fun stuff. Now, how do we secure these things? Okay, so in this demo, what we're going to do is we're going to set one of these APIs to basic auth authentication, and then we're going to leave the other API as API key controlled. Okay, we'll see what that means in a moment. Okay, we're going to look at the basic auth config to ensure we've got users defined. Because remember, we talked about users, groups, roles. So we're going to take a look at that. We're going to create a new application called Online Pet Store Application. We're going to create and approve a subscription to each of those APIs from this application. And then we're going to actually test each of the APIs using Postman and then using the API keys. Okay. So let's get started. So we're going to set get prospects to basic auth. Okay. So get prospects. We're going to change this authentication method to an external authentication provider. And you can see these are some of the authentication providers I've got configured. Right now, we're just going to use basic auth. Okay. Hit save. Okay. And now we've got that one done. We're going to, okay, so we left the pet store API as API key controlled. Now let's take a look at the basic auth configuration. Okay, so basic auth, oops, actually, sorry, wrong spot. External authentication. So these are all of our authentication sources. So this is our broker/gateway that I've deployed, and these are the authentication sources that we've defined. So let's take a look at the basic auth one. And remember that slide where I shared users, groups, and roles. So this is where this comes into play. So generally the way you configure this is you start from the right and work your way backwards. So you start with collection of privileges. So that's what these 2 things are. We can be an administrator or just general. We have groups. So these are collections of people. And then users. So I've got 3 users defined, myself, Greg, and Mary. Okay, just so we can provide some sort of differences between these. Okay, so we've seen our basic auth users. Okay, so now we're going to create a new application. This is going to be called Online Pet Store Application. We're going to create and approve a subscription to each of the APIs from that application. Okay. So now I'm in, again, this is still within API management in Boomi, and this is the application screen. Okay, so you can see there's no applications. So I'm going to create an application. This is going to be a gateway application. Okay, so this is going to be actually managed by the gateway that we've defined. Okay, we said we were going to call this Online Pet Store. Application owner name. Let's just have me own this one. Username. Okay, and that's pretty much all we really have to fill out there. Okay, hit save. And now we have our application. However, this application doesn't have any subscriptions. So that means I'm me, but I don't have access to anything yet. So this is where we start to create that access. Okay, so we're going to subscribe, and I'm greedy. I want to subscribe to both of these because they both look really cool. If it finally lets me select it, yes, it does. Okay, there we go. So, and you can see there's 2 plans that I can choose from for each of these APIs. Okay, so hit next. So which plan do I want? So for this demo, we're just going to do unlimited APIs. We'll show the rate limiting one later. Okay. And then on this screen, you can actually you can future date this. So you can pre-configure access in the subscription to a future date. And then you can also set an automatic disable date, but we're not going to do either of those things. We want it to take effect immediately and not get disabled. Hit next. Okay, so same thing for the Pet Store API. Remember, there's 2 APIs and building subscriptions too. And again, I'm going to select the unlimited, hit next. Same exact screen here, and then we'll hit finish. Okay, so now we have pretty much what we need to get access to both of these APIs. And you can see over here, these are the API keys. Okay, so we'll start by testing out the Get Prospects API with this API key. Okay, so I just copied Get Prospects, and we're going to execute that from Postman. Okay, this one is misnamed. Sorry, let me get this out of the way here so I can see what I'm doing. Okay, so yeah, this is misnamed. This should be basic auth. Because you can see clearly we're going to use basic auth here. This API key is no longer valid, but we're going to plug in the one that we did have, the one that we just showed you. This uses a standard header called x-api-key. Okay. In the basic auth screen, it can be pretty much whoever's configured under basic authentication. So all the users that we just showed you. Okay. We're going to go ahead and hit send. Fingers crossed. And there we go. So these are prospects that are, we're getting these out of Salesforce. So you can see this works. Okay. Okay, and now we also want to test our Pet Store API. Okay, so we've got an API key. We've copied that. Go back to Postman. Okay, this is our Pet Store API. So if you recall, one of these we changed for the authentication type to basic auth. That was the one we just showed you. It was the Get Prospects API. And this one, we're just identifying via API key, just to show you kind of a difference in how that works. Okay. So for this one, we're going to do no authentication. However, we're still going to use this X API key header. Okay. We'll replace that API key with a real one. Hit send. And now you can see results coming back on that. Okay. So basically, we've configured a subscription. We've created a new application. We configured a subscription to each of the APIs with that application. We got the keys, the API keys for that, and then we've tested those using Postman. All right, chugging right along. All right, this is one of my favorite ones. So this is getting a little bit more sophisticated. So what we're going to do here is we're actually going to change the authentication type for the Get Prospects API. We're now going to use SAML for that. And to act as an identity provider, we're actually going to integrate with Okta for SAML. Okay. And then once we've done that, we're going to create a new subscription. Okay. We're going to save off that API key, and we're going to get an access token from Postman using the credentials that we configured, and then we're going to go ahead and test with that API. Okay. So we're creating a new application for Get Prospects API. So again, going back into API management, we're going to look at deployed APIs. Here's our deployed APIs. So Get Prospects is the one we're going to change. Let's select that. Now we're going to actually select SAML. Okay. And now these are sort of all the things that your consumer is going to need to authenticate to this API. I've got this pre-configured in Postman, and we'll see that in a minute. Okay. So go ahead and save that. Okay. And then we're actually going to create a new application. Okay. This application, we'll just call it SAML application. Okay. Can be the same owner, that's fine. Hit save. Okay. So now we actually have a SAML application, but again, we have no subscriptions to anything yet. Okay. So we're going to actually create a subscription. Okay. And this time, let's just subscribe to the Get Prospects API. Hit next. Let's stick with unlimited for now. Hit next. Choose the defaults for all these. Finish it up. Okay. So you can see here, now I have an API key. So I'm copying that. Make sure we haven't skipped any steps. Okay, we've got our API key. Now we're going to get our access token from Postman and invoke it. Okay, so here's the Get Prospects SAML example. Okay, so you can see we have OAuth 2 configured. Let's change our API key. Okay, so we've got a valid API key now. And now what we're going to do is we're actually going to get a new access token. And so you'll see kind of where all these URLs and things come into play. Okay, so again, this is kind of what we saw on the API management screen. We need a callback URL, the authentication URL, access token URL, client ID. Okay, we'll hit request token. And fingers crossed. Okay. So it's asking me to actually log into Okta, which is a good thing. Sorry, I need to move my screen a little bit. Okay, so it's asking me to authenticate with Okta, which is great. It's exactly what we want. So I'm going to do that right now. Okay. Hit sign in. Interesting. Okay, here we go. Lost my screen for a second there. Sorry about that. Okay, so you can see I got my new access token. Okay. Now I'm going to go ahead and say use this token. And then if I hit send, I should actually have access to get prospects, just like before. And you can see it's gone through and basically the same thing as before, but now I'm actually authenticating against using SAML against an Okta identity source. Okay. All right. So let's make sure we did everything. Yep, we've tested the API with the access token. Okay, awesome. All right. So for our final demo, as we're kind of almost running out of time here, so I'll try to speed up just a little bit. So our final demo, we're actually going to go to the developer portal. I'm going to authenticate to the portal using that user Mary. I'm going to create an application via the portal. So this is going to be a little bit different. Remember, we were creating applications within API management. And if you noticed, there was no approval workflow. And that's because I was actually authenticated as an administrator. So everything just got created right away. This time, we're actually going to come in as a user. We're going to create a request. Those requests are going to get approved. I'm going to get access to the APIs. And then we'll go ahead and test those APIs and also show off kind of how the rate limiting plan works. Okay. All right. So portal. I wish I could hide this thing. It's always in my way. Okay. So developer portal is right here. Okay. So you can see, actually, I'm going to log out just to make sure I'm logged in as the right person. So we said we were going to log in as Mary. So that's Mary 1234, most secure password in the world. Okay, so we're logged into the portal. So now as Mary, I would like to have access to both of these things actually. But I'm going to start with the Pet Store API. Okay. I'm going to create actually the first thing I need to do is create an application, sorry. Okay, so the application name, we said we were going to call that Pet Finder. Okay. We can create a description if we want. Finder application. Okay, we'll default to enabled. Owner name is required. We'll just call her Mary. Mary at mary.com. Okay, then we'll go ahead and hit register. Okay, so nothing more to do from an application standpoint. Anybody can create an application. It's super easy. Okay, but now what we want to do is we actually want to create a subscription. Okay, so we can browse the API catalog to subscribe. I said I would like to access the Pet Store API. Okay, so you can see this is kind of an overview. This is kind of showing, this is your typical sort of Swagger screen, right? This is showing all the things that you can do with the API. We're going to hit the subscribe button. Okay, you can put an optional message in here like, hey, my name's Mary. I'd love to subscribe to this application or this API rather. Subscribe. Okay, so now what this did is this submitted it to API management to get approved. Okay, so now I'm going to come in, go to the approve dashboard, and I can see that there's a pending approval here for Mary. So go ahead and click on that. and we're friendly, we're nice, so we're going to go ahead and say approve. And now this is where we get to decide, what we want to assign to Mary from a plan perspective. And this is also where my cell phone analogy diverges just a little bit. Normally, your provider doesn't choose your plan for you; you choose your plan. But that's just the one area where this breaks. So for Mary, we're going to select the 5 calls per minute plan because we wanted to demonstrate that functionality. All the rest we're going to keep, again, kind of the defaults. And then we can send an optional message to the requester as well. Okay, we're going to hit approve. Okay, so now if I go back to the portal, what I should see here is the ability to actually, if I go to subscriptions, Pet Finder, you can see I actually have a subscription that's enabled. Okay, so if I hit that, here's my subscription details. And again, there's that API key that we're going to need to actually invoke this. So I'm going to copy that. Okay, and then pretty much right within the API catalog here, I can test this. So the first thing I'm going to do is authorize myself. So we're going to paste in that API key that I just got, hit authorize, and notice how that the lock icon just locked because it means I'm now authorized to use this API. Okay, and then we can kind of play around. So this is the API. So for example, I can just do a get store inventory call here. Hit try it out. Execute. Okay, and you see I got a 200 code back, and this is the response body. So we know that this works. Okay, now let's try that same thing from Postman. Okay, so here's Postman. Here's the get store inventory API. Okay, so again, this is our our header for the API key. We're going to replace that with what we got as part of our subscription. Okay, from an authorization standpoint, we're using basic auth. Okay, we'll go ahead and hit send. Okay, and you can see, similar to before, I've got some nonsense data, but data nonetheless. So we've got some data back from the call. Now, remember we said that this was a rate limited plan that was capped at 5 calls per minute. So let's see how that works. There's a second call, third, fourth, fifth, sixth. Okay, that's interesting. There we go. Huh. Well, that is indeed interesting. I haven't seen that before. It finally did catch up and said we've exceeded our limit of 5, but actually I think we submitted like 7. So that's quite interesting. I'll have to take that one away and see what happened there. But at least we did see basically that we exceeded our plan limit, and we get basically a status code back on that. Okay. Looks like we wrapped the demo pretty much just in time because we're almost out of time here. So just very quickly, let me go through kind of some of these final things, and then we'll go ahead and wrap up. So another thing is the API management dashboard. You can actually access that right here. Okay, and then you can organize by day, week, month. So you can see basically some basic things about API calls, some basic metrics. Okay. So what did we cover today? So the difference between API management and integration on the Boomi platform, API management conceptual model, the role of gateways and brokers from an infrastructure standpoint, users, groups, and roles from a security standpoint, API consumers, plans, applications, and subscriptions. We've deployed an API service component. We also deployed an API proxy. We tested using basic auth and API keys, as well as SAML with Okta. We set up the developer portal. We requested an API subscription in the portal. using that subscription, we've invoked both from Postman as well as within the portal, and also kind of demonstrated the API rate limiting, which oddly behaved a little strangely today, I have to admit. But yeah, so we've showed kind of how rate limiting works. And then finally, we just took a quick look at the API management dashboard. For those of you who are interested, there's some references and tools that I used to sort of put this demo together. Other than that, that is all that I have. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Have a great day.